Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway at the Garrison Church of God. I'm glad you joined me for the 4th of July. I always like the 4th of July. It's a wonderful, wonderful time to celebrate our nation. We are blessed to live in the United States of America with all of its freedoms and opportunities. We've been troubled by a lot of things in these last few years, and there are detractors who look at our nation and claim that it's something that it's not. We certainly have had our problems in the past, and we will have our problems in the future. But all in all, the United States is one of the best countries around. In fact, there has not been a nation like it in world history. And so I'm thankful that I live in this country and am a citizen of this country. I have been blessed. I want to talk to you about blessed in our lives, being blessed. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, Peter talks very pointedly about certain aspects of living life and also of godliness. In verse 3 of that chapter, he says, "As his divine power has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue." I was fascinated by 4 of the words in that particular verse, and I want to talk a little bit about them as I share a little bit about my message today, this blessing. The 4 words are first, life. Peter uses it for a challenge to us to live exemplary lives. He uses the word godliness to indicate to us our need to reflect God's nature and please God, because the word for godliness literally means good worship, and we need that in our lives. He says that comes out as we reflect the glory of Christ in our lives. And as we reflect that glory in the world, it transforms everything around us. And so that glory is a part of what we are. And then he talks about the need for virtue. Virtue is moral excellence. And Peter wants to challenge us to build our character as we live our Christian lives. I found that fascinating because Peter, throughout his life, and we actually know quite a bit about Peter's life because a great deal of it is shared in the process of Scripture. We understand that development of character that was a part of who he was and what he was. America's had character developing events in our history. One of those character developing events took place during the 1850s. In the late years of the 1850s, in fact 1859, Abraham Lincoln was preparing a series of speeches prior to the Republican Convention of 1860. He gave those speeches from September through February of 1859 to 1860. The speeches were given in Ohio and in New York. In his notes was discovered this particular quote: "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who would pervert the Constitution." Abraham Lincoln never, to our knowledge, spoke those words in a speech, but they were in his notes, and they reflected his personal feelings and struggles in that particular year. 1859 was the culmination of a great many things. The 1850s had brought some terrible things to our nation. The beginning of the 1850s began with the fugitive slave law. It basically put the resources of the American government's bureaucracy at the disposal of slave owners who were trying to recover the slaves that had escaped to the North. And it was a terrible law. It caused all kinds of brutality as a result of this particular law. Following on its heels in 1857 was the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court, one of the worst and horriblest decisions the Supreme Court has ever made in our nation. It declared that black people were subhuman, which people around the United States found the concept that was given by our Supreme Court abhorrent. It was a horrible, evil decision by a Supreme Court. And then, with the election of James Buchanan in 1857, you had a deeply committed slave president who absolutely was determined to destroy any dissent. He targeted the Republican Party, the newly forming Republican Party, and tried to destroy it. He wanted it completely wiped out because of its abolitionist views. And so James Buchanan did everything within his power as the President of the United States to hamper, hinder, and destroy abolition. Abraham Lincoln in 1859 had good reason to feel these thoughts and to have these emotions as he prepared to go into the convention that would nominate him for the presidency of the United States. It was a troubling few years in our nation. Many people were confused and troubled. In 1857, the black abolitionist Frederick Douglass would, on July the 4th, give one of the most condemning speeches of the American people. He was reflecting on the election of James Buchanan, and he was reflecting also on the Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott. His frustration with America and its failed promise, its failure to live up to the ideals, was scalding and, to be honest with you, well-deserved. Those were troubling times, and as people living during that time, there were people, we were questioning who we were as Americans. Abraham Lincoln brought us to a realization that those types of views were wrong. They were destructive and they were immoral. It is interesting that when it comes to his second inaugural speech in 1865, he puts everything in a framework. Not only does he call for reunification of our nation and crossing of the great divides that had been created in the Civil War, but he also talks about why the Civil War happened, the immorality of slavery, the immorality of treating people because of the color of their skin as less than human. It was a transformative moment. In the White House afterwards, when he was greeting people, the person he most wanted to talk to and to get his opinion on his inaugural speech was the man Frederick Douglass. That and the Civil War must have had an impact on Frederick Douglass, because following the Civil War, he became deeply committed to constitutional principles. He believed very strongly in the Constitution of the United States and its ability to transform our nation. He would go on to be an ambassador for the United States. He would go on to lead and direct in the suffrage movement. He would become a tremendous leader in our nation. And it had a lot to do with his belief in the Constitution, his belief in what America could and should be, the blessing that America could be. I'm troubled that so many people in our nation don't believe in that blessing anymore. They don't believe in the hope and the determination of America. They really honestly, in some ways, don't believe in our Constitution anymore. All of those things are deeply troubling. Peter was a man with failings and struggles. He was a man who struggled day in and day out. He had a number of failures that are, well, they are shared in Scripture. I'm sure that many of us would not care for those foibles in our lives to be written down, but Peter had many of those foibles written down, his failures. And even after he became a leader in the Christian community, became the primary leader in the community, he had another failing. It's recorded for us by the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 2. There, Peter makes a serious error. He is fearful and concerned about people that have come from the Jerusalem church that are deeply committed to the Jewish faith, and they are troubled by this influx of Gentiles into the Christian community. And so Peter separates himself from the uncircumcised Gentiles and refuses to eat with them and treats them as unclean. Paul becomes very upset by this. He becomes upset with how it's affecting and shattering and breaking up the Christian community. And he says, I challenged Peter face to face, that he was in the wrong. He was doing what was wrong. Clearly, Peter accepted this correction in his life because he writes about the acceptance of the Gentiles in his first letter and how they are equal heirs of the Christian faith. Peter shows what it means to be a man who is able to be corrected, to be challenged, and to be changed. One of the powerful things about Abraham Lincoln was his willingness to challenge his own conceptions and his willingness to challenge our nation to live up to the standards of our Constitution. And Frederick Douglass would challenge us as well. They are men who were patriots. Peter was a man who taught us and challenged us to live godly lives. That simply means he challenges us to be God-honoring in our lives, to worship God with our living process. And sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes we need to be corrected. But you know what? The grace of God helps us. It strengthens us. It challenges us. It changes us. And as we look into the grace of God, it makes us people that are godly. We are a blessing in the world. We are a blessing. Thank you for listening. God's blessings on you.